I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name, soft and close, as if their lips were just inches from my ear. My heart jolted, and I froze. The room was pitch black, except for the faint red glow of the alarm clock, but I knew I wasn't alone. Then I felt it, a cold, damp hand wrapping around my ankle, its grip tightening with every second. My breath caught in my throat as I kicked instinctively, but the hand didn't budge. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now, hissing words I couldn't understand. I reached for the bedside lamp with trembling fingers, but before I could turn it on, the hand yanked hard, dragging me halfway off the bed. My scream echoed into the dark, but it was swallowed by the sound of something heavy shifting in the shadows. A sound like wet, dragging footsteps moving closer. The voices stopped, the hand let go, but the room was too silent now, and I knew. Whatever it was, it hadn't gone far. Elliot stood on the lighthouse balcony, staring out at the endless stretch of black water. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in bruised purple and reds. He shivered, though the evening air wasn't cold. The lighthouse is rotating. Beam flickered to life, sweeping the rocky shore in rhythmic pulses of light. Inside, the space felt even emptier than before. The narrow spiral staircase creaked. With each step as Elliot climbed down to his room, the walls were worn, the paint peeling in thin, curling strips. As he unpacked his bag, his foot nudged something. Looking down, he saw deep gouges in the floorboards near the door, scratches that seemed too deliberate to be randomware. He crouched to trace them with his fingers. That's when he noticed the door. Its inside surface was clawed with matching marks as though someone or something had tried desperately to keep something out, or in. The thought made his stomach tighten. He brushed it off and went to bed, but the stains on the ceiling above him, dark, rust-colored blotches spreading like spider veins, made sleep come slowly. Elliot awoke to the sound of heavy pounding against the lighthouse door. The room was pitch black except for the thin sliver of moonlight slicing through the curtains. Bang, bang, bang. Each knock was louder, more insistent than the last. His heart pounded in his chest as he threw off the covers. The clock on the bedside table read 1:42 a.m. He froze as he remembered the second rule: never open the door between midnight and 3 a.m. Bang, bang, bang. Elliot crept toward the door, his breath catching his throat. The banging stopped, abruptly leaving behind an oppressive silence. He held his breath, listening until a soft scratching started on the other side, long drawn-out nails dragging against the wood. He stepped back, his hands trembling. The scratching stopped, followed by a faint, breathy whisper. Elliot. Dawn's first light had never been so welcome. Elliot sat in the kitchen gripping a steaming mug of coffee, his eyes darting to every shadow. He hadn't dared open them door after the banging stopped, but the air in the room had felt heavy, oppressive, until sunrise. As the light of morning crept over the water, Elliot moved to the window to calm his nerves. That's when he saw it, a figure, standing on the rocks below, staring up at the lighthouse. Its features were indiscernible in the early light, but it was watching him. He blinked, and it was gone. The first time Elliot heard it, he thought it was just the wind, a low, warbling moan that drifted through the stairwell late at night, but then came again, unmistakably human, rising and falling in soft, fragmented whispers. He froze at his desk, gripping the pen saw tightly. It left an imprint on his fingers. The sound moved closer, echoing through the lighthouse as though someone was climbing the stairs. He stared at the spiral staircase, lit only by the flickering beam of the lighthouse lamp above. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, shifting with each sweep of the light. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving silence that felt heavier than any noise. As he stood, the light overhead flickered once, twice, then bathed the room in a sickly yellow glow. His shadow stretched grotesquely across the floor, its edges jittering unnaturally, as though it didn't belong to him. The next morning, Elliot's nerves were still frayed. The whispers hadn't returned, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. He needed answers. Rummaging through the drawers of the desk, he found a leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed, ink smudged in places, but the desperation in the handwriting was clear. They're always watching, one entry read. I can feel their eyes, even in the daylight. The lamp is the only thing keeping them at bay. Another page was scrawled with the words shadow men, underlined 3 times, below. It, a frantic warning. Once they know you're here, they'll never stop watching. Elliot slammed the book shut, heart pounding. He glanced at the window, half expecting to see something staring back, but there was only the horizon, cold and gray. That night, the lighthouse felt alive. Its walls groaned as though stretching, its timbers creaking under an unseen weight. Elliot sat at the small kitchen table, forcing down spoonfuls of canned soup. Then it came, a sharp, deliberate knock on the glass. His spoon clattered into the bowl. Slowly, he turned toward the window. A pale, expressionless face was pressed against the glass. Its features were wrong, too smooth, like a wax figure, and its eyes were entirely black. Elliot froze, his breath shallow. The face didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in an instant, it was gone. But the sensation of being watched lingered. The air felt suffocating, thick with unseen eyes. Elliot couldn't sleep. The face haunted his every thought. In a desperate bid to distract himself, he decided to inspect the lamp. Climbing the narrow spiral staircase, he felt the air grow colder with each step. The beams above creaked faintly, as though something heavy was shifting its weight. Halfway up, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs behind him. The sound was unmistakable. The groan of wood, the soft scrape of a soul. He froze, his grip tightening on the rail. The journal's warning rang in his head. Don't turn around. The footsteps stopped, but the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He felt a cold breath brush against his ear, accompanied by the faintest whisper, keep climbing. Elliot sat at the base of the staircase, the journal open on his lap. His hands trembled as he reread the warning about shadow men. His pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse wasn't just alive, but aware. Every creak, every groan felt like a subtle shift of attention, as if it was watching him. The rules on the wall loomed in his mind. Never open the door, ignore the knocks. But how could he ignore the things happening around him? The face at the window, the whispers, the footsteps that shouldn't exist. His fear boiled over into frustration. I can't take this anymore, he muttered, slamming the journal shut. I need to know what's out there. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Elliot sat by the door, flashlight in hand. When the first knock came, sharp and deliberate, he didn't freeze. He stood. Elliot swung the door open, the cold air biting against his skin. The night was eerily calm, the sea as smooth as black glass. Nothing moved except the faint shimmer of moonlight on the waves. He stepped outside, scanning the rocky shore with his flashlight. Who's there? He called, his voice trembling but defiant. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, from somewhere far out on the water, a wailing cry echoed, a sound so guttural and sorrowful it made the hair on his arms stand on end. It grew louder, rising and falling like the mournful call of something in pain. The door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the lighthouse. Elliot spun around, his flashlight flickering. The air felt wrong, heavy and pressing, as though the world itself was holding its breath. When he finally pushed the door open again, the inside of the lighthouse was darker than before. The warm glow of the lamp above had dimmed, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift as he moved. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elliot climbed to the lamp room. He checked the mechanisms, trying to distract himself. The moment he touched the lens, a voice rasped behind him. Elliot. He froze, The voice was low, like a growl, but familiar. It sounded exactly like Walter. "Leave now," it hissed, "before it claims you too." He whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty except for the faint, rhythmic click of the light. Elliot woke with a start, sweat soaking his shirt. Something was wrong. The room was darker than it should have been, the faint glow of dawn blocked by an unmoving figure. At the foot of his bed. It was tall, unnaturally thin and featureless, a void in the shape of a man. Its edges shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising from asphalt. Elliot's chest tightened. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't lunge, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the window, the shadow dissolved into nothing. But on the floor where it had stood, the wood was blackened, as if scorched by fire. Fire. Elliot stumbled through the lighthouse, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the oppressive silence. The days had begun to bleed into one another, the unbroken monotony of the island eating away at his sanity. He hadn't slept in what felt like days. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel it, that suffocating presence, pressing down on him. The shadows in the lighthouse were changing. They moved unnaturally, stretching and shifting even when the light stayed still. As he climbed the stairs, he swore he saw one dart just out of view. He whipped his head around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. He began talking to himself just to fill the silence. "It's just my mind," he whispered, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned white. "I'm just imagining things." But he didn't believe it. Deep down, he knew something was watching him. Desperation finally drove Elliot to explore the overgrown graveyard behind them. Lighthouse. The wind was unnaturally still as he pushed through the rusted gate, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. Rows of weathered headstone leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions barely legible under years of decay. He froze when he saw the names. Thomas O'Malley disappeared 1947. Margaret Hill disappeared 1963. The pattern continued, each name followed by the same grim word. At the very back of the graveyard, half hidden beneath a tangle of weeds, was a fresh headstone. His breath caught in his throat as he read it. Elliot James, disappeared. The date was blank. Panic overwhelmed him. Elliot didn't pack, didn't think. He just ran to the dock, dragging the old rowboat into the water. The oars groaned as he pushed through them. Mist, the lighthouse growing smaller behind him. The further he rowed, the thicker the fog became, swallowing the horizon. Hours passed. His arms burned, his lungs heaved, but he refused to stop. Finally he saw land, a faint rocky shore in the distance. Relief flooded him, and he rowed faster. But when his boat hit the shore, he realized it wasn't a new place. It was the lighthouse. And standing on the rocks, waiting for him, was the Shadow Man. Elliot barely made it down the stairs before the lighthouse erupted into chaos. The pounding started first, violent, relentless, shaking the walls as though the structure would collapse. It came from everywhere at once, the door, the windows, the floors. Stumbled back, hands pressed to his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside.
His skull, his skull.
The whispers followed, rising into a cacophony of screams. They hissed his name, mocked him, roared with laughter, words twisted together into a maddening, incoherent symphony. Shadows oozed out from the walls, long and jagged, stretching toward him like grasping claws. They darted across the room in chaotic bursts, moving too fast to be natural. One brushed against his leg, icy and sharp, and he jumped back, crashing into the staircase. The lighthouse itself groaned as if alive, the timbers buckling under some unseen force. Elliot scrambled to the window, desperate for an escape, but the sea was unnervingly calm. There was no storm, no wind, only the silent, mocking stillness of the horizon. And then he heard the footsteps, heavier now, coming up the stairs. Panicked, Elliot fled to the light room, slamming the door shut behind him. He pressed his back against it, chest heaving. The lamp above flickered weakly, casting erratic beams that only made the shadows seem to grow. They were there, the shadow men, not one, but many. They formed a circle around him, their faceless heads tilting unnaturally as though mocking his fear. Filled the room, louder now but still unintelligible. He couldn't tell if they were speaking or laughing. "Leave me alone," he shouted, voice cracking. He grabbed the nearest object, a wrench, and swung it wildly. The shadows didn't flinch. They only closed in tighter, their presence suffocating, oppressive. The journal on the desk flipped open on its own, pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible wind. The pen moved across the paper, scratching out fresh words in jagged, frantic strokes. "You are the keeper now. You always were." Elliot stared in horror as the words glowed faintly, then faded into the page. He dropped the wrench, his hands trembling. His breath came in shallow gasps as the realization set in. The lighthouse wasn't just alive, it was hungry. It had been feeding on him, breaking him down piece by piece. And now it had him. The lamp sputtered once, twice, then extinguished entirely. The room plunged into complete darkness. Elliot's scream tore through the air as the shadows surged forward, engulfing him. Cold hands gripped his arms, his legs, pulling him down as the whispers turned into roars. He thrashed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The shadows consumed him, dragging him into the void. His screams echoed through the lighthouse, rising above them. Relentless, pounding. Then, silence. Outside, the sea remained calm, the horizon undisturbed. The lighthouse stood still, its light dead. Walter guided the small boat toward the jagged shore, his weathered hands gripping them. Oars tighter than usual. His passenger, a young woman named Claire, sat across from him, her wide eyes fixed on the distant lighthouse. It loomed against the horizon, its faint, rhythmic glow slicing through the fog. "Remember the rules?" Walter muttered, his voice barely above the crash of the waves. His gaze darted nervously to the tower. "Light the lamp, never open the door at night. And whatever you do, don't look behind you." Claire frowned, brushing back a strand of hair. "Is this some kind of initiation ritual? Freak out the new girl?" Walter didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line as they neared the dock. The lighthouse was silent, its windows dark and lifeless, but the air was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. He could feel it pressing against his chest like a vice. As Claire stepped onto the dock, her boots crunching against the wet wood, Walter hesitated. His hands trembled as he passed her the key. "Don't stay too long," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Claire offered him a puzzled smile, then turned toward the lighthouse. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the damp, musty interior. And on it, a leather-bound journal lay open, its ink impossibly fresh. She stepped closer, curious, and read the words aloud. "You are the keeper now. You always were." Her voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the silence. She glanced around, uneasy, but nothing moved. Then, from the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow flicker against the wall. Outside, Walter was already rowing away, refusing to look back. Behind him, the lighthouse light sputtered weakly, then began its slow, steady rotation. That night, as Claire lit the lamp for the first time, she heard it, a faint knocking on the window. It was soft, almost polite. Ignoring it, she climbed the stairs, the journal tucked under her arm, but with each step, she felt the air grow heavier, colder. When she reached the top, she turned, just for a moment, and saw it, a dark, featureless figure standing at the base of the stairs, watching. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story, or is something watching from the shadows? I woke up to a scream. My own. The dark shape standing at the foot of my bed was all wrong, too tall, too still. My heart slammed against my ribs as I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stared, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. A cold breath swept over my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me. No one, just the weight of silence pressing down on me. The shadow lunged. I scrambled back, my hands crashing into the bedpost, but it was too late. Something cold and damp wrapped around my throat, squeezing tighter than it should have been. Possible. The worst part wasn't the choking, it was the whisper. It was my voice, whispering in my ear, just behind me. Welcome to your new home. Adam stared at the letter, the ink slightly smudged as if the words had been written in a hurry. His uncle's handwriting, shaky and almost frantic, filled the page with unsettling warnings. There are rules, it said, rules you must follow if you wish to survive. He scoffed, dismissing it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many years alone. The old man had been eccentric, no doubt about it, but Adam had no intention of following these bizarre superstitions. He had inherited this duty and he wasn't about to be cowed by empty threats. Still, something gnawed at him as he made his way toward the graveyard. The town felt oddly quiet even for the outskirts of a rural area. No birds, no cars, nothing but the sound of his footsteps crunching on the dry gravel road. The air was thick and heavy, making his chest feel tight, but Adam chalked it up to the heat. As he approached the entrance to the graveyard, a shiver ran down his spine. The gate creaked open with a reluctant groan, and Adam stepped inside. The place looked exactly like he imagined, a forgotten, crumbling cemetery overrun with weeds. Tombstones tilted at odd angles, the ground uneven and wild, but it wasn't the neglected state of the graveyard that unsettled him. It was the silence. It was as though the entire place was holding its breath. Adam ignored the feeling of unease that tightened in his gut. The task at hand was simple enough. Trim the overgrown grass, straighten the tombstones, and make sure everything looked decent. He grabbed his tools and set to work. But as the hours passed, a creeping sense of discomfort grew. His eyes kept darting back to certain graves where the soil was strangely disturbed, as if someone had recently dug into them. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. By dusk, Adam's stomach tightened with an inexplicable dread as he walked to the far side of the graveyard to check on an unmarked grave. He stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold, a strange, cryptic symbol carved into the earth. It wasn't something he'd seen before, something that wasn't part of any gravestone. It pulsed in the dim light, as if it were alive. His uncle's warning echoed in his mind, louder than ever. The graveyard will take what it needs. The next few days felt like they dragged on forever. Adam couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the graveyard was alive in ways he couldn't understand. Every morning he'd wake up to the same oppressive silence, only to find the graveyard even more twisted than the day before. The soil in the graves had been disturbed again, as if someone or something had been digging. It wasn't just the graves that unnerved him. The air felt thick with dread, and every time he turned around, he could swear there were footsteps behind him, but when he spun around, no one was there. The ground seemed to shift underfoot, the tombstones leaning just a little farther over than they had been the day before. Adam could feel it in his bones. The graveyard was watching him. The isolation was the worst part. His phone barely worked, the signal cutting out before he could even call anyone. The town was too far away to walk, and the few neighbors he didn't seem to notice him anymore. It was as if the graveyard had drawn him into its world, away from everything. It was suffocating. One afternoon, Adam was cleaning up around a cluster of graves when he noticed something odd. A strange symbol had been carved into the side of one tombstone. The lines were jagged, almost like they'd been made in a hurry. He traced them with his finger, a chill running down his spine. There was no explanation for it. It wasn't a family name nor a date of death, just a symbol, one that felt wrong. He tried to shake it off, but the air around him felt heavier. As the sun began to set, Adam's chest tightened with anxiety. The dread was becoming unbearable, as though the graveyard itself had grown restless, hungry. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the task at hand, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, the feeling followed him inside. He could hear faint whispers from the darkness, as though someone was standing just outside his window, but when he looked, there was nothing, only shadows stretching unnaturally across the yard. The whispers were getting louder, and the graveyard wasn't done with him yet. Adam sat in his uncle's study that night, flipping through the old journals with growing dread. The air in the small room was thick, the oppressive quiet closing in around him. His uncle had written pages and pages about the graveyard, its rules, its hunger, but the last entry, dated only a few days before his uncle's death, shook him to his core. They know I've seen too much. I'm being watched. There are rules that must be followed or the graveyard will consume you. I've broken one, and now it won't stop. Until I'm gone. Adam's heart skipped a beat. What had his uncle meant? What rules? He hadn't believed any of it. The cryptic symbols, the whispered warnings. But as he stared at the journal, the room seemed to shrink around him. The whispers from outside had returned, louder now, almost urgent. He could feel something watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The words on the page seemed to blur together. Broken one, it won't stop, Adam couldn't shake the image of his uncle, pale and trembling, scribbling his final warning. He had been scared, terrified even, and now Adam understood that fear. He thought back to the strange events he'd witnessed, disturbed graves, shifting soil, that terrible symbol carved into the stone. His uncle had been right, something had been broken, and now it was coming for him. He shoved the journal aside and grabbed his coat. His pulse raced as the room seemed to close in around him. He needed air, needed to get out, but as soon as he stepped into the graveyard, a shiver ran down his spine. The wind had picked up, swirling around him in a way that felt unnatural. The whispers were louder now, like a low hum in the distance, and it felt as if the earth itself was calling to him. Something moved at the edge of the graveyard, a shape in the darkness. Adam froze. The figure was too tall, too thin, and then, as if sensing his fear, the figure vanished. The graveyard was alive, and Adam had already broken the rules. Later that night, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The silence around the graveyard was suffocating, thick with dread, and every creak of the wind felt like a warning. He had already checked the crypt earlier in the day. It had been locked, secure, but now, as he stood just outside the entrance, he couldn't help but feel the pull, the compulsion to go inside. Against his better judgment, Adam made his way to the crypt. The moment he stepped through the iron gates, the air grew colder, as though something had shifted, something unseen watching him closely. The whispers returned, low and mournful, curling around him like a fog. He tried to shake it off, tried to tell himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but deep down he knew it was more than that. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan. Adam hesitated, his heart pounding. He stepped inside, the darkness pressing in on him like a physical force. The faint glow of his lantern barely cut through the blackness, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure of his uncle, standing at the far end of the crypt, gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in tattered clothes. The ghostly figure did not move, did not speak, but Adam could feel its eyes boring into him, as if it were waiting for him to acknowledge it. His legs felt like lead. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind screamed at him to run, but the figure kept staring. Then, a soft whisper, barely audible, grazed his ear. Close the crypt, before it's too late. He spun around in panic. The ground beneath him shifted, and before he could react, He saw it, an unmarked grave freshly dug. The earth was torn open, revealing a rotting corpse that seemed to reach toward him, its eyes, milky and hollow, locked onto his. Low, guttural moan echoed from the grave. Adam stumbled backward, his heart racing, but the grave was still there, the corpse still, reaching for him. And the whispering didn't stop. Adam couldn't breathe. The air in the crypt was thick, suffocating, and every step he took felt like it was dragging him deeper into something terrible. His body trembled, frozen with fear, but his eyes couldn't look away from the open grave. The rotting corpse, now fully exposed, seemed to twitch, its fingers scraping the earth as if trying to pull itself free. A terrible realization hit Adam all at once. This wasn't just some twisted prank, some figment of his imagination. This was real. The graveyard was alive. It was hungry. His feet moved without thinking. He turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled through the crypt, desperate to escape. Something caught his eye. Hidden door in the back, barely noticeable beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. He reached for it, his hands shaking, and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dark room, the air fetid with the scent of decay. The walls were lined with old, blood-stained tools, their surfaces crusted over with years of dried gore. Ritualistic symbols were carved into the floor, the walls, and even the wooden furniture. In the center of the room lay an altar, its surface scarred and worn, as if it had been used for countless years. Adam stepped inside, his pulse racing. He knew, he had always known, that his uncle had been hiding something, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. As he approached the altar, he found a journal just like his uncle's. It was open to a page filled with more symbols and frantic, desperate writing. The last line was clear, and it struck Adam with the force of a hammer. The graveyard demands payment. I've already given it too much. Adam's stomach twisted. He was the payment now. He had inherited this responsibility, and he had broken rules. And now there was no escape. Adam stood frozen in front of the rusted gates, the chill creeping down his spine. He had walked this path 100 times since he arrived, but today it was different. The graveyard felt alive watching him. The rusted iron gates creaked in the wind, and as he stared into them, his reflection didn't look right. His face, his own face, grinned back at him, but it wasn't a smile of relief or even a grin of exhaustion. No, this was something darker. The smile was wide, unsettling, and too cruel to be his own. His heart thudded painfully against his chest. He blinked, trying to force his body to move, but his feet felt heavy, as if something was holding him in place. Didn't change. It just kept grinning. A sudden gust of wind ripped through the graveyard, rustling the dead leaves at his feet. The grin in the reflection grew, pulling wider. Adam's breath hitched. His reflection wasn't him anymore. It was someone or something else. It felt like it was alive, watching him, mocking him. "Stop it," Adam whispered, his voice cracking, but the reflection didn't obey. It tilted its head, as if acknowledging him, then mouthed something. The words were silent, but Adam's stomach dropped when he realized it was his own voice whispering, "You can't leave." Fear surged through him like a tidal wave, and in that moment, he knew. The graveyard that had him trapped, it was something else, something ancient, and it was waiting. The reflection faded for a moment, and Adam rushed past the gates, but the grin lingered in his mind. The graveyard wasn't finished with him yet. It was only just beginning. That night, as Adam sat alone in his uncle's old chair, the unsettling feeling gnawed at him. The whispering had never stopped since he'd arrived, the soft hum of it curling in his ears, almost like the graveyard itself was breathing. His uncle's journals offered no peace, only more cryptic warnings, the rules, the rituals, worse lurking in the soil. But tonight, the whispering grew louder. He stood, pacing the room, unable to shake the growing dread. The door slammed, opened suddenly and his breath caught. A woman, her face hidden behind a veil, stood there, motionless. The same woman he had seen standing at the graveyard watching him from a distance. She didn't move, but Adam could feel her presence press against him, like a heavy weight he couldn't escape. Then, from her hand, a small folded letter fluttered to the ground. It landed in front of him, and he bent down to pick it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried and jagged. "You're the new keeper now. Follow the rules or become one of them." The words were chilling, the threat unmistakable. Adam's fingers trembled as he read the letter again. He had been warned. He turned to face the window, his mind racing. He had to break the final rule, the one that had haunted him in his uncle's journal, the crypt. He had to open it completely. He had to see for himself. As Adam walked toward the door, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of a voice. "It's too late for you." Adam's hands shook as he reached for the heavy iron door. He had broken every rule. Up until this point, ignoring the warnings, the whispers, and the ominous symbols that plagued his every step. But now, with the crypt standing before him, he could feel the weight of every choice he had made. His uncle's voice, taunting and pleading, echoed in his mind. "Don't open it. Don't wake it up." But it was too late. He had already crossed the line. The air turned cold as he unlocked the crypt. He could feel it then, the shift in the air, the pressure that pressed against him like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching. The doctor creaked open, and the darkness inside felt thick, suffocating. Lantern held high, his pulse pounding in his ears. The space was small, damp, and unnervingly still. It smelled of earth and rot. His lantern flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the stone walls. And there, in the center of the room, was the truth. The coffin wasn't what it appeared to be. It wasn't filled with a body, a corpse that had passed away years ago. No, it was alive. A swirling, dark mass of shadows, shifting and writhing, seemed to pulse within. The coffin, the sight of it made Adam's heart stop. This wasn't death, it was something older, something worse. Before he could react, the ground beneath him trembled. The walls of the crypt groaned, as if something ancient was waking, stretching. Adam froze, his body refusing to move as the whispers grew louder, closer. "You've seen it now. You've awakened it." The air was thick with panic as Adam stumbled backward, his heart racing out of control. The crypt felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing against him like the graveyard itself was trying to swallow him whole. His mind spun, unable to make sense of what he had just seen. The mass in the coffin, it wasn't a body, wasn't a spirit. It was something ancient, a force beyond his understanding. He turned, frantic, to escape, but as his foot hit the ground, the earth beneath him seemed to shift. It trembled, vibrating as if the graveyard itself was coming alive. From the corners of his eyes, he saw them, figures rising from the graves, shadows stretching unnaturally toward him. Faces, pale and twisted, watched him with hollow eyes. The graveyard had never been about keeping the dead at rest. It had been a prison. The realization crashed down on him like a wave. The graveyard wasn't simply a burial ground. It was alive. The crypt wasn't just a tomb. It was a gateway to something more. Something that fed on fear, and Adam had fed it his fear for days. He backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. Panic surged through him as he clawed at the walls, but they wouldn't budge. His uncle's voice, once a warning, now echoed in his ears, laughing, mocking. "You've already broken the first rule, Adam. You're part of it now. There's no escape." The ground trembled again, and Adam's heart sank as the walls of the crypt began to
Close in around him.
Adam's breath came in sharp gasps as the graveyard around him seemed to tighten, its shadows stretching toward him like fingers. His body trembled violently, but his legs felt rooted to the earth. The crypt's walls closed in, and the ground beneath him buckled as though the very earth was alive, hungry, The whispers escalated into frantic screams that tore through his mind. His uncle's voice, once a warning, now laughed in his ears. Too late, Adam. It's already begun. The last of his strength drained from him as the darkness swallowed him whole. His heart pounded, each beat slower, weaker until it stopped. He felt it then. Cold, pulling him down, deeper into the graveyard's depths. It wasn't the earth. It was something worse. His body seemed to sink, as if he were becoming part of the land itself. The graveyard was not just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, and Adam was now one with it. His body was buried within the soil, his eyes wide open, staring into the dark void. His soul, however, remained trapped, forever bound to the cursed ground he had tried to escape. The graveyard had claimed him. It was its keeper now, as it had claimed so many before him, and like the others, Adam would follow the rules for eternity, tending to the graves, protecting its dark secrets, and waiting for the next poor soul to take his place. But it didn't end there. In the distance, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, growing closer. Unknowingly drawn to the graveyard approached. He was carrying a letter, an inheritance, a new keeper. The letter, handed down through generations, lay heavy in his hands. It read, "Follow the rules, or become part of it." The graveyard was never finished. Its hunger was endless. If you dare, share this story with someone else. But remember, each retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows